I guess you didn't really make the point that people shouldn't at all get into politics. It was more they shouldn't for that reason. Or am I
Yeah, that's correct.
understanding that correct?
And one point of the video, I made like this distinction. Like, I think there's a difference between getting into politics for like the desires of this world versus getting into be like the salt and light, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'll read it. So what it comes down to, though, is this question. Is trying to influence the government come from a place of trying to please God or a place of worldly desire? It could be either, and I think it's up for each person to decide where that line is. For me, personally, I think it's believe something like speaking out against abortion is something that's being the salt and light, like we were commanded to do. However, if you want to get involved in politics so you can leave a better country for your children and grandchildren, where does that desire come from?
So yeah, there you make the distinction that it depends largely on what your motive is and what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And notice that I use the. Have you ever listened to a speech, and I'm sure you've heard like, this taxation is going to leave a huge burden on our children and grandchildren. Mm-hmm. That line is like thrown around so much, and everybody uses it, especially Christians. And I want,
especially politicians, really.
Well, like it's a line that we use because we think we want to think of it. We want to use a motive that's higher than ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And that's children and grandchildren.
Yeah, and I'm trying to make the point that even that's not a good enough motive.
That's not a good motive.
Yeah.
Well, doing something for your children and grandchildren for their lives is not a good motive. Doing something to improve their eternal outcome, that's a different matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a thing that is thrown around a lot, especially I think of like things like global warming or open borders or think there's a lot of topics like this where that I think is especially used, where it's like, if you can't do it for yourself, at least do it for your children and grandchildren. Give them a better world.
Yeah.
So the main point you were making is essentially, well, our goal is not to give them a better world than this world, because it's never going to really be better.
Yeah.
We need to be focusing and teaching them to long for the next world, which is going to be better or much worse, depending on how ready they are.
And I like to think, that verse, you must hate your family and your own life.
If anyone does not hate his own father and mother, brother and sister, yes, and even his own life. And I'm not sure if that's an exact quote, but yes, and even his own life, he cannot follow me, I think.
Yeah, and I think the point of that verse is that we don't put our family above like our walk with God.
Mm-hmm. It's not saying you have to hate your family. It's saying compared to how much you are devoted to and love Christ, compared to that, your love for your family is like hate.
Yeah.
It's in comparison, you would give up your family and all your possessions and everything for Christ.
Yeah, and so I like to think this verse applies here when I say this, is that, if you're choosing politics over pursuing Christ because you want to leave a better country for your children and grandchildren, that's going against that verse.
Mm-hmm. Which I think a lot of people who, Christians who do care a lot about politics and talk about it and even try to get involved in it, I don't usually think that is their motive, at least not consciously.
Yeah.
I think their motive is that they want to, make a more moral country or something like that.
Yeah.
But often it either comes across as not being that way, or they're really not actually.
Well, they might start out that way, then they get just swept up in it, and then they end up just being like everybody else who's in politics,
mm-hmm.
which is not necessarily bad by worldly standards. I'm just saying it's not our main focus.
Mm-hmm.
So you could go into the good focus, or you could be, or I believe people that go into politics to try to make this world a better place are somewhat misguided, because that's not the best way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The best way to do that is to make disciples and to strengthen the church, because who's leading this country is not going to influence the moral culture of this country.
Mm-hmm.
It's the activity of the church that's going to influence the morality of this country.
Yep.
And so either way, even if you are going in with good motives, I think you're somewhat misguided to do that. If you're going to get heavily involved to try to change the moral framework of the country, because it's not the best way to do it.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it's misguided. See, I'm of the opinion where, so say hypothetically, like I was going to run for a political position, or eventually, like I was going to try to become president or something like that. I would do it for moral reasons and to be the kind of spiritual leader that I would think the country would need. And I would think that in that kind of case, with that kind of motive and that goal, that's not such a bad thing.
Yeah.
So I guess our opinions slightly differ on that. Is that I would think. See, I have no problem with getting into politics as long as, or someone getting into politics or being highly invested in it, as long as their motive is right, which and as long as it's not a distraction.
Thanks for watching this clip from the Salt of the Earth podcast. To watch the full episode, click the link in the description.